Hello, everybody, and welcome to Bold Radio. I'm your host, John McLeese. Sometimes in life, you just need some good advice. No one is an expert at everything. That's why we're proud to present the Bold Radio Expert Series, where we welcome a qualified and experienced individual to offer sound advice on an aspect of running a business. Our guest is a highly qualified legal expert. We're pleased to be joined today by Donn Pirie. He's lawyer and partner at the Winnipeg law firm Taylor McCaffrey LLP. Donn brings with him an expertise today on the subject of leasing commercial spaces. There is no place like home, and when you're running a business, it's worth careful consideration when choosing a location for your organization to call home. Location is everything, but so is how the lease costs affect your bottom line. That's what we'll be talking about today. Donn, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
It's great having you. Let's say I found the ideal space for my business. It's the perfect location, and I'm interested in leasing this location. What are my first steps that I need to initiate to get that transaction going?
Good question. Typically, their landlords will engage a broker who may be responsible for listing the property to interested parties, interested businesses. Usually, the first step from speaking to the broker is what's called a form of offer to lease, and that's basically where the nuts and bolts, the business terms are. What's the rent going to be? What's the square footage? Any restrictions on use and that sort of thing. It's typically a smaller document. It can be anywhere between 2 or 4 pages, that sort of thing. There's no hard and fast rule. Once the terms have been agreed to between the landlord and tenant, the offer to lease is signed, and that triggers the next process, which is the formal lease document that will be prepared. More often than not, the offer to lease will contain enough provisions in there to form a lease arrangement, but the landlord will typically have spelled out in much greater detail the various terms and conditions of the lease. That's where you would then engage either your own broker to assist you with that process. Typically, people would review that formal lease agreement with their lawyer, banker, accountant, all the sort of standard advisors that people would look to when they look to set up a business. What's the common length of a commercial lease, Donn? There's no sort of hard and fast rules, although my experience over the years is typically the common length of a lease agreement is 5 years, and there's typically one or more rights of renewals, typically, again, for a period of about 5 years. As I say, there is no hard and fast rule, and it really depends on the character of the space, the type of business. As from the landlord and tenant's perspective, oftentimes the term being longer with the renewals gives more certainty. If you're going to be fixturing the premises, obviously you're not going to want to be putting in all that cost and then losing the premises a year later. So I would say, most commonly when people are looking to set up some sort of retail business, 5 years would be pretty much the most standard. Shorter arrangements are usually for specific purposes. If an industrial tenant, for example, needs just some additional storage space or warehousing, you might find 1 year terms, 1 year renewals, that sort of thing. But 5 years would be more common. Is there any concerns associated with having an extended lease past 5 years, for example, like a 10-year lease? Well, under a 5-year lease, the leasehold improvements that are placed into the premises are tax deductible, or there's some tax treatment for it, which I won't get into because I'm not a tax lawyer. And you tend to lose that ability if you have a longer term lease. The other problem with a long-term lease from a tenant's perspective, and frankly from a landlord's perspective, is you're locking yourself in for a very long period of time. It may be that the business doesn't work out. Maybe the landlord wants to change the use of the premises. All those sorts of things can play into it. And if you've signed a 10-year lease, then both are obliged to live with that 10-year lease. Who is typically responsible for maintenance of a leased premises? Can you go over that, our obligation? Yeah, okay. That's a great question because it's obviously a bit of a tension between the landlord and the tenant. I shouldn't say tension, but it's something to be discussed anyways. Typically, when you look at the maintenance of the premises, the tenant is responsible for the interior of the premises. So basic fixturing, bathrooms, that sort of thing. Other types of basic maintenance might be removal of garbage and snow and that sort of thing. The landlord typically will be responsible for the structural elements of the building. If you're looking at a sort of standard strip mall scenario where you have several tenants, the landlord will be responsible for maintaining the structural integrity of the building, the windows, in some cases the roof, that sort of thing.
So let's just move now to the whole cost per square foot, and I guess the issue that I want to talk about is the difference between a gross lease and a net lease. I've heard those terms bandied about quite a bit, and can you kind of give us a definition of each of those?
Sure. I can tell you it's a bit of a spectrum, if you like. But if you look at the one land, and a gross lease is typically thought of as an agreement between landlord and tenant where the rent and maintenance costs and everything is sort of a single amount. So just for the sake of argument, that's $1,000 a month that's paid to the landlord. And then the landlord's responsible for things like common area costs, taxes, things of that nature. So it's just a simple, at the end of the month, tenant writes a check for $1,000. Landlord then runs its business and tries to make sure it can minimize those costs. A net lease, which is on the other end of the spectrum, is thought of best as the rent that is paid by the tenant is net to the landlord. So that $1,000 that we used for the last example, in a net lease concept, that $1,000 is going into the landlord's pocket at the end of the month. And then there are costs for maintaining the premises. And that's what's, I think we're going to talk about in a second, which is additional rent. So things like taxes, the cost of landlord's insurance, some forms of maintenance, those are all costs that are attributed to the tenant, collected from the tenant on a monthly basis. And the landlord will put that $1,000 net lease rent in their pocket at the end of the month.
So, yeah, that's my final question, and you led right into it. Is can you explain the difference between rent and additional rent, common area costs of a space?
Right. It does lead nicely into it. So in the net lease scenario, what you're looking at is common area costs, or sometimes called additional rent, and those are the expenses of basically running the shopping center or the shopping strip mall, if you like. They're typically collected on a monthly basis in advance by the landlord. So there'll be an estimate of, let's say, $10 a square foot of actual rent, and then an estimate of, say, maybe $5 a square foot of what's called additional rent. And that additional rent is collected on a monthly basis. At the end of the year, there's a reconciliation statement with all the tenants. If the tenants haven't contributed enough, then there's obviously a bill that's coming. If the tenants have paid too much, then that's reconciled as well. In terms of the way that additional rent is typically calculated, it's very simple. If you have a sort of a freestanding structure where there's a single tenant, obviously whatever the costs are in terms of taxes and additional rent are just attributed directly to that tenant. If you have a situation like the strip mall where maybe you have 5 tenants with varying sizes of square footage, then it'll be broken down usually on a proportionate basis based on that square footage. There are differences in terms of calculating those square footages or percentages, and obviously the stronger the tenant might be able to reduce their, not percentage, but maybe what their contribution is. But for the most part, it's allocated on a proportionate basis.
Lots of things to consider when leasing commercial spaces, and that's why we're talking to Donn Pirie, lawyer and partner at the Winnipeg law firm Taylor McCaffrey LLP. Donn, thanks very much.